Good morning, everyone. My name's David Armenti. I'm the Vice President of Education and Engagement here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Very, very exciting to see this many folks excited to learn this morning with us. And of course, we know why, because of our illustrious guest of honor. So I have the pleasure of introducing Michael Twitty. But before I get started into that, again, just want to thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. This is the fourth installment of our Wye Oak lecture series, the first of 2026. So very exciting to have you all with us, and certainly hope this is not the last time that we see you in the building for a variety of reasons. But again, very excited for our program this morning. Michael Twitty is somebody who I've been hearing about throughout all of my time in the field, going back to my time at the Maryland State Archives about 15 years ago, very early on in my career. So having that really inspiration to learn about this type of material and connect it to our local culture has been very exciting, and I'm really excited to learn more as well today. So with that, I'll introduce with a quick bio, but let him do all the storytelling today. So Michael Twitty, Michael W. Twitty, is an African-American Jewish writer, culinary historian, and educator. He's the author of The Cooking Gene, which won the 2018 James Beard Foundation Book Award for Book of the Year, as well as the category for writing. His third book, KOSHERSOUL, was published in 2022 and was the first book by a Black author awarded the National Jewish Book Award. Twitty had made appearances on Andrew Zimmern's Bizarre Foods America, Taste the Nation, Netflix's High on the Hawk, and Many Rivers to Cross with Dr. Henry Louis Gates on PBS, and many, many more appearances and accolades. So with that, I'm going to turn over to the stage to our guest this morning. So let's welcome Michael Twitty.
All right, cool. I was worried about that step. Oh my God, it's nice to be back in the homeland of Maryland. I live in Virginia now. No, it's thanks to my husband who is here and helped me get here this morning, because I have had a whirlwind 36 hours. I've been all the way from Alabama to Georgia to South Carolina, North Carolina to Virginia to here, to DC to here. So I am trying to stay awake. Margaret was like, do you want some alone time? I said, no, because I will fall asleep and you want to have a presentation. I do know where to start. So yeah, come on. Come on, ancestors, I need you. So I am a native Washingtonian, also a semi-native Marylander. I have decided not to say Maryland ever again, unless I'm referring to Maryland, because I feel like there's a certain feeling and connection that comes from rolling our R's the way we do. Anyhow, one of the first things I did, I kind of got going when at a point where I was like, okay, I maybe need to jump into this social media and food thing, and I don't do it very well. I just tell the truth. And I started with a project that I published on my printer called Fighting Old Nep. And Fighting Old Nep came from the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, when he talks about, how children, let me just say it like it is. Children had to fight the dog for the scraps from the master's table. And I immediately did something that made some people very disturbed with my work, and that was a good thing. I remember one guy saying, yeah, it's about the food, not the history, not the whatever, and I said, that's your story. That's not our story. And we've done that way too long. The smiling black cook in the background, making food to make white people happy and make them have a certain kind of life. I mean, Frederick Douglass was enslaved on the largest plantation in Maryland, on the Eastern Shore in Talbot County. The Great Wye House he talked about, that was so big that some people got sold away because they complained about their slaveholder because they'd never met them before. That's how disparate the communities were on that plantation. And it really set me on a path because everybody was talking about everywhere but Maryland. It was always Virginia or Mississippi or wherever. And I'm like, wait a minute, hold up. Benjamin Banneker was from here, and his grandfather was an enslaved man from West Africa, specifically Senegal, Senegal and Gambia accounted for 60% of all the Africans brought to this state. And the rest were from Ghana and from Congo, and a few from Nigeria. We don't talk about the fact that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, they were not from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. No, they were from here. And if life here was so damn great, why did they run? Why did you take 300 people from here? Let's ask this question a lot. And also, we have to also ask the question of what made this place unique. You know, they talk a lot about how Baltimore had one of the largest free black populations. They don't tell you why. It wasn't because people were benevolent. It's because they didn't want to take care of us anymore. They didn't have the resources, okay? So tobacco wore out the land, and wheat did not require as many black folks. And it was easier to hire for a season free blacks and immigrants than it was to maintain a large plantation anymore. Despite the fact that the largest slaveholder 250 years ago, the richest man 250 years ago, at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, had over 300 enslaved people, both working tobacco and his iron foundry. And now that we have the research of the DNA from the enslaved people at Catoctin and other ironworks, it's like those numbers about the trade prove true. Who came, who was there, and now I think they're trying to do a thing with 23andMe, connecting the DNA samples with descendants, which is fantastic. But Baltimore was a huge community of free people, but the only issue was they're living side by side with 3,000 enslaved people. You know, a huge group of black folks who are free-ish living next to enslaved people. Why do I say ish? Because the minute you stepped into Baltimore County, you better have your papers with you. The minute you leave the boundaries of the city. And of course, they're still doing basically slave labor, for lack of a better term. Most of them are not wealthy. They're not like the black folks in Philadelphia who are establishing dynasty businesses and journalism, et cetera. It takes the cult community a little bit, even though they do have barbers and grocers and other things, and certainly people who cooked. So I was really fascinated with the state that I grew up in. Even in Montgomery County, where I grew up, there was a whole history there. I remember going to a presentation, and was about archaeology. And there was a cabin, there were more than one cabin where they had, crystals and quartz as power objects. The power object I loved the most was there was a home of slaveholders in Montgomery County where they found under the entrance to the house a small, how do I say this nice? They found a wooden phallus made from soft pine. And so somebody was trying to hex somebody. And that was deep. And it was a pretty accurate looking phallus, I should say, as a queer man. But it just shows you that there were so many things going on here. We know about the power objects found in Annapolis and other places. And so all these amazing stories get hidden by the fact that people don't recognize that story is a big part of Maryland's history and culture. And it's okay to say that there are parts of this country which share regions. I don't really think of this state as mid-Atlantic. I think maybe Baltimore is south by northeast or northeast by south, in the same way that Louisville is south by midwest-ish, and the same way that Austin and other places in Texas are south by southwest. And we have to recognize that people migrate. Times change. resources change. At the time of the Civil War, it's really safe to say that there were two large populations of European Americans in Maryland. One was immigrant, German, Irish, etc., and one was British, Scots, Irish, German that was here before, but thoroughly integrated into the plantation and enslavement economy. And if you know anything about how this worked, these groups appealed, when they wanted to join that culture, they had to assimilate into that British slaveocracy. The same thing happens in Louisiana. You know, all those families down there are not Creole. Some of them were German and Irish, and they just took on names that were, had that kind of Francophile leaning, kind of fake it, like Whitney Plantation. Those are Germans who married into Creole families who then they put on the architecture and the language, they learned to speak fluent Creole, all that stuff. And the people they enslaved were that mixture of Creole, Caribbean, African, and African American. And so that's the lens in which we have to view the good state of Maryland. Not to mention the fact it had a Catholic history, which is really interesting. I seriously doubt that the ancestors who were here, who were under Catholic slaveholders, didn't do things that were similar to what we see in the Caribbean and Latin America. In other words, syncretism. And I think that it's really important that we also understand the Caribbean connection to this state. So I champion the fish pepper, right? Well, that is one example of peppers, okras, tomatoes that came from the Caribbean, namely Haiti and Jamaica, Antigua, and Barbados. Those are the four places that have a deep connection here. And when people came here after the Haitian Revolution, when they came here with slaveholders who were reestablishing themselves, there was even a plantation in Frederick County, of all the places we can think of, that had all the enslaved people came from Haiti. And so it's like, why are we missing all this? Well, number one, I grew up with Washingtonian magazine. In the back of Washingtonian magazine, you would always see in the back where it advertised real estate, it would be like, lovely historical estate. Georgian mansion from the 18th century. Lovely outbuildings. And a dock to the river. Well, you know what that dock was for? Tobacco. And you know who else that dock was for? And so this continuous kind of like hiding behind, or people rewriting this state as, well, the border state is fair. It's fair. It is fair. But also, so is the fact that, thank God, that good old Abe Lincoln decided, I don't really love him. I like him, but I don't love him. Our ancestors were like, oh, thank Jesus for Master Lincoln. To hell with him. But anyways, thank God he decided to jail Tawny and the rest of the legislature, or else I wouldn't be up here and he wouldn't be in the audience. Because Maryland had resources, industrial resources, that the Confederacy desperately needed. But again, this story and this food story is not about the damn Confederacy. I wish people wouldn't define the South, which goes beyond the borders of the Mason-Dixon line, by the Confederacy. And I got in trouble because I was, my good friend Aaron Hutchinson from the formerly Washington Post, since they fired everybody, interviewed me, and he put the story in the Post, and I said, I am not going to, establish Southern food history or Southern identity by 4 years of white supremacy rule. Of course, people thought, well, they don't know our history. Those of you who know me know that ain't right. I've been doing this since. My point is that people elevate that Confederacy, even though it was a failed experiment of traitors to the United States of America that relied on the abuse, exploitation, and extraction of labor of human beings who didn't get paid a cent for building this damn country for free. So that's how we gonna say that. We're no longer, we are no longer going to privilege that. The wind done gone, like the book says, right? there's another part to this. People don't realize that a lot of, for example, the Mississippi Delta, and we talk about migration, wasn't a thing until the 1870s and 1880s. Okay, it was wilderness. And so there's this idea that every corner of the census South was settled, was developed, and had a long history, and it didn't. The people who went to Kentucky, Missouri, part of Tennessee, and certainly parts of the southern Midwest, which is the other Mason-Dixon line. If you go under Highway 70, above it, predominantly people from New England, Pennsylvania, New York. Below it, predominantly southern people, like Abraham Lincoln's people. They were Virginia to Kentucky to Illinois, southern Illinois. Same deal with Jefferson Davis. They came from the same state, Kentucky, the other Maryland. They died, they heard that, but it's true. I mean, okay, think about it. Kentucky Derby, Preakness, right? And all their stuff. We had rye whiskey, they had bourbon. We had the original country ham from Southern Maryland, and they had their country ham. The chicken, it was Maryland fried chicken, it was Kentucky fried chicken, daggone it. I know how people feel when they're in Charleston and Savannah, and they go like, but also like it's closer to like New Orleans and Mobile. Have you ever been to Mobile? What's the first thing they tell you? Well, Mardi Gras started here first. It's like, well, nobody knows who you are. Sorry, Mobile. And I say that as a proud descendant of Alabamians. And get this, I remember one time the first time I went down there, Michael, I've heard that you're going to our lovely sister city of New Orleans. Well, first of all, Mobile had the first Mardi Gras. And second of all, New Orleans is a lovely sister city, but she has so many transients. And, well, we are sisters, but she is a sluttier sister. Like, dang. What? So if there is a southern boundary, it has to be that. But I think one of the things that kind of muddies the water is the fact that those German and Irish immigrants who came at the time of the Great Revolutions in Europe, 1820s to 1840s, 50s, they were not assimilating into a plantocracy. They liked being themselves. They liked being relatively anti-slavery, or at least in the case of the Irish, not wanting to mix with us and not wanting to compete with us. And that's a very different story, but they were on the Atlantic-facing coast. The further you go in, generations pass, and those German Americans are just like any other white Southerner in Missouri or in Kentucky or the places. And this is what I call this line. If you actually draw a line between Delaware to Maryland and over to Kentucky, and then you go down through Missouri and over down into Texas, it's this really fuzzy cultural line. But it's also another cultural line that goes up to, like I said, Highway 70. And so it gets really complicated really fast, and we have to be able to appreciate that nuance. Now I'm going to go back really quickly to fighting on that. Because when I started looking, I started finding things, and I was just like, oh, okay, these are just things that people haven't really talked about or seen or heard of. References to hunting and eating possum and squirrel and rabbit in the WPA narratives. The Maryland WPA narratives are very small. They're very small, but they're not impossibly small, and they contain a lot of rich information. But so does Charles Ball, who is also from here, and so does Josiah Henson. They all talk about food, and Charles Ball was amazing because even though Douglas gets a lot of credit, by the way, he is the most photographed human being, not black man, human being of the 19th century. That's wild, isn't it? Like for generations, most of our ancestors never had a portrait made of them ever. But this brother walks out of slavery and he becomes the most photographed. Also, I had the occasion to sit on the plane one time side by side with Jewel Parker Rhodes. And she wrote a book called Douglas's Women, I highly recommend. And we think of Frederick Douglass as like this stately dude. Well, He was a player, like big time. She told me there was a saying about him. I don't know why I'm telling you a business, Mr. Douglas, but okay, fine. They came on and said, I'm tired, they're tired, we need to be woken up. Thank you, sir. And it was said about him that it was a privilege to introduce your wife to Mr. Douglas. Dang. He had himself a German Jewish girlfriend, and she was head over heels in love with him. And she's like, don't go back to that country. Stay here with me and be free, and we can get married. He said, maybe I can get back to you about that one. And he rolled out, and she committed suicide. Sorry, unalived herself. And I'm like, that's serious. But like, he left a trail. I felt bad for his wife. He left a trail of women. So I wanted to see that next book, The DNA of Douglas. Because you know it wasn't all the time. But I say that to say that we have these major figures, these people left their stories. And unfortunately, we don't have more stories. That's why we take these emancipatory narratives, and we take the narratives of former enslaved people, and we take archaeology. And the archaeobotany of Maryland is so specifically beautiful. Like in Annapolis in the 18th century, finding peanuts peanuts were not common food. So guess what? Somebody had to grow them. You know, knowing that people here had okra, knowing that fact people here had hot peppers, knowing people had rice. Now you think of rice, you're thinking of commercial. No, it was oftentimes rice and cotton and other things like that were also grown for domestic use. When you have 10,000 pounds of rice being grown in Wicomico County, accounted for on the census, and then there was red rice, watch that, being grown in southern Maryland. Where is Ariza glaberrima growing? It's growing in West Africa, in the areas where rice-growing people come from, like Senegal and Gambia. I've seen it myself. I've been to 8 countries in West Africa. So when you put this together, there's this whole alternative history that we aren't privy to. Not to mention the fact that people don't really understand what that German heritage is, and that really bonds Maryland with Pennsylvania. I mean, it's not because one group of people were this place and one group of people were this place. It's because the Great Wagon Road went from Philadelphia outward and then down into the mountains. And Frederick has always been a very strong part. Frederick down to Germantown, that's what they call it, Germantown, right? These are very big spots for German-speaking people. And so a dying tradition here, but it's kind of picking up in West Virginia and Virginia, is Fox Knox, which is an American way to say the kind of donut that you make at Christmas time in the German community. And it's part of a big festival, community festival. Now we have to account for indigenous people first, right? Because without them, although I will tell you something I found out during my research was that the corn, the maize that was grown here, wasn't their maize. It was actually from the Caribbean. And it was grown by indigenous people there and then by enslaved people in Barbados. Then they brought that seed to the state of Maryland, the colony of Maryland, and then that became the basis. Remember, these are oat and porridge eating people, the Europeans, right? They don't know about maize. And then they have to learn it really quick because yes, you can grow oats here and you can grow rye here, but here's the thing. Those things would eventually become just mainly for animals. Yes, they did eat oatmeal on occasion, but they ate hominy here in Maryland. Not grits, hominy. The big corn that was treated with lye water. And that increases the essential amino acid lysine in the corn. It puffs it up, you have to rinse it out a couple times. You can't eat lye. You can put it in your hair and conk. But you know. You have to wash it out, you have to clean it. You know. The point is that eaten with beans and squash makes for a complete diet. There's a reason why sunflowers, maybe sometimes chenopodium, otherwise known, its cousin as quinoa and leaves, squash, beans of many sorts. They didn't have one or two types of beans, right? You know this. Indigenous communities farmed at least a dozen types of each of these things. It had different tastes, different uses. You know, the type of bean they used for the bread, for bean bread, was not the type of bean that we might eat in a bowl with chili. You have to understand that. And also, there were certain types of corn that produced green corn, which we would consider now sweet corn, which is really underripe corn that's milky, right? And then the kind of corn that you would make into your cornmeal that would sustain you through the year. We're also talking about the extinction of certain types of plants. There used to be a lot more prickly pear in Maryland. Spanish moss used to be all the way up into the eastern shore. But the original colonists were like, hey, we got to make money, so anything we can, package up and sell and send over to London. So they denuded all the trees of Spanish moss. It's like wild, right? And then, of course, Western Maryland was the frontier for most of our colonial history. So you're talking about different groups of indigenous people, Iroquoian speakers, mainly Algonquin speakers, and Siouan speakers and beyond. And so they're always moving and shifting places. And so the influence in diet is profound, but not as specific as we might like. And part of fighting Old Net was focusing on the enslaved people and African influences. So there was a book, I don't care to remember the title, because they pissed me off. But the book basically, it was about Maryland's food, culinary history, but not really. The great Cara did not do it. I love her. But it was about this other person. We actually talked about it. And the book didn't basically say anything. It said, them Africans didn't do nothing here. They didn't have any influence. They didn't have any impact. Unfortunately, you don't know how to read. Unfortunately, you've never been to Africa. When I first went to Colonial Williamsburg and started my interaction with them, you know what I was told? We don't know anything much about how the blacks ate because there's just no records. Meanwhile, they'd had 30 years of archaeology under the cabins and the places where enslaved people lived and cooked. You have no evidence? They never once thought, maybe we should go to Nigeria where 60% of Virginians, Africans came from. They never once thought. Let's ask people questions. Let's do oral histories in the community. It was, no, we don't have anything about that, unfortunately. So if in American English, when you are saying that something tastes good, especially from the time you're very young, what do you say? It's yummy. Yum, right? Okay, cool. So these women who did, a lot of the women who did that cooking were from the Wolof, the Sera, the Fulani, and related groups in Senegambia. So I want you to understand something. They didn't come here speaking English, and they didn't feel the need to speak English the entire time. In fact, there's a really intriguing reference in Douglas's biography, not the little one, the big one, where he says that he's living, remember, he's living born in the early 1800s, and I think he only saw maybe one or two as a little boy to the last tobacco harvest that was wearing out the land. But he also says something really cool, which was, so he's living, in that, it was 1817 around he was born, we think. And so then later on, he's there and he's like, the people on Master Lloyd's plantation, the black folks, he said they spoke a certain dialect. And they used words like una and udem, and they said bukra. What does that sound like? Gullah Geechee. And so I remind people that Gullah Geechee is only special because the land, the rice, the interaction in that specific environment, but the language represents the early African American English that was spoken by the community for the community. So anything else was code switching. We could do that. We know how to do that beautifully. And so when you hear that in these tantalizing few phrases, you go, oh my God, hey Douglas, give me some more. Can you give me some more so I can know what this is about? But that's how they spoke. And when you understand that, they were doing a whole different thing. Another element that really got me was that enslaved people, especially in the greater colonial period and early antebellum period, had a practice in multiple places of hiding what they were growing. They weren't telling them everything about themselves. And a lot of the gardening would happen when? At night, especially under a full moon, okay? And so they would not tell white folks what they were growing. Why? Because they would take advantage of it. And if they took advantage of it, they would do, what's the next move? Hey, Negroes, you can't grow that anymore. Because if you grow it and I grow it, I don't know if you're going to steal from me. That's what Jefferson did. The great thinker. He couldn't even stop his children from being black. Who was his best chef? A black man named James Hemings. He could pass, but he was still black. He still had my nose. And was the greatest chef in early America. So when we talk about these people, we're talking about language, cultures, customs, that of course they didn't make it to paper to be documented. They were never supposed to be. It's like that, the Underground Railroad happened here. Why didn't they say that in 1850? Really, because, it's not like George Washington slept here. I live in Virginia, and that sign is everywhere. I bet he did. But the issue for me is that you expect documentation from unlettered immigrants and Africans who were told on pain of death, you cannot read and write. And then want to tell me I didn't leave a history. No, the history is all over the place. It's in proverbs, it's expressions, it's in customs. It's in ways of being. And that's the part that gets me. For them to say there was no African influence in the cooking of Maryland. Oh, really, that stuffed ham? Now, it's okay to say that Europeans, especially the British, and Africans kind of had this. And remember, indentured servants also. It's not just white folks up here and black folks down here. A lot of times it's white folks and black folks. And they're not living separate lives. They're not living Jim Crow lives. Jim Crow was an experiment in trying to assert white power. After these people had lived together for centuries, some of you have heard of the Marylandgens. Remember, we are the 11th tribe of Israel. We are the Turks. We're Italian. No, you are Negroes who married white folks and then went up in the mountains and had good hair. The word Marylandյան comes from Malungo, which is Kimbundu, one of my peoples, from Angola. They were the original people who came to Jamestown and other places. It means my shipmate. Shipmate for what? The Middle Passage. See, when we say we're the culture, we ain't joking. Okay? It's really okay to admit and talk about how these cultures connected, how they influence each other, and how they made an impact. There are runaway ads where freedom seekers, young Negro, wears his clothes, and speaks German passably. Why? Because he was held in bondage by Germans. Or James has run away from my farm. He speaks the Scots-Irish dialect. In fact, there was a situation in North Carolina where a Scottish woman is writing about her experience on one of the rivers in the southeast part of the state. And she says she heard the most beautiful Gaelic on the river. And then the boat shifts and she sees the people. She says, oh my God, I gotta get out of here. Why? Because both men were West African. And she thought she was gonna burn up and turn black with the heat. That's what she said, not me. That's how they were Cherokee-speaking black people, okay? There were definitely Nanticoke-speaking black people here in Maryland. And some of those had absorbed words from Mandinka. There's a famous article from the 19th century about this, and it's like, oh, look, we found these words of Nanticoke, and they were all Mandinka. We have a lot to learn, is my point. We have a lot to learn. And then, of course, we still have these amazing oral histories that trickle down. I was on Kojo Nnamdi's show one time, I'm sitting in the studio, and this guy, I wish I had taken his name down. I really wish I had. And he said, I remember going to a barbecue on the Eastern Shore, like he said 50 years ago, which is great, right? And he talked about how they had a whole hog and how one of the foremen on this particular farm, formerly plantation, had like a big machete thing and he chopped up the meat. And it was like, people don't think of barbecue in Maryland, right? They don't think about all these little things. And by the way, when we talk about the Senegambian connection, since we have no African influence in the state of Maryland, fried fish. Their barbecue is called DB. And I almost killed myself with DB. It was during Ramadan, so we waited till nighttime. And then we go up and they have the DB. And this man looked apart. And when I thought about the guy's story about having the machete and all that stuff, in Africa, they don't believe in small knives. It's always a panga. It's always like this, right? With a handle, a cutlass, basically. And homeboy, he was, I don't know what is about this man. He was probably a little bit younger than me, very proud looking. This was in Dakar. And so his whole setup was there. And he's waiting to eat because he hasn't eaten. But behind him is this whole situation. And it's fire with this wood and this grill. And these, lamb, and there's no pork, lamb and beef and chicken and guinea fowl and duck and fish and everything. And the spices, of course, you got to put the rub on it and have the sauce with it, right? Man, they handed me like this butcher paper thing of lamb and chicken. Lord, I almost killed myself. Salt, hot pepper, kani. And what is an essential part of every Maryland garden back then? Cayenne pepper. And some of these things went like this, not like this. It had to go from people in South America with Arachis hypogea to Africa and then back across the ocean to the Chesapeake, okay? And there's this sauce that they had. It wasn't really a sauce. It was like sauce piment, which is their hot sauce. It's not like our hot sauce. And mustard, moutarde. They have their own situation with locust bean paste, but they have the more French style moutarde. And then you kind of and of course Maggi. Not the Maggi in the bottle, Maggi, the bouillon cube, baby. You mix it all together and put with them onions, the grilled onions. With that, it's serious. It is love. It is love. But then I thought about it. Chere, the staple porridge of Senegal, is pretty much just like grits. I kept thinking about all these things, and the thing that got me the most was when they pull out their okra soup, okay? And it got their crabs in it. Crabs and this, and they have steamed crabs in Senegal, big time. And you're just like, wait a minute, nah. And yokos, oysters, are one of their favorite things. And I was like, wait a minute, the pirogues that you see on the rivers are the same kind of little boats they had on the Chesapeake. And you're just like, wait a minute, hold up. I've been conned. Because think about it this way. The tobacco, right, was a major crop in Senegal in 1607. What's happening? They just barely discovered it. John Rolfe, right? Just barely. It takes him to 1613. So I'm trying to say that they were already growing wheat and rice and maize and tobacco. And another important crop was the cowpea, the black-eyed pea. So, and herding. And what are the people of Senegambia known for the most? They're the horsemen of Africa. Who won the Kentucky Derby all the first times? Black men. What was a major business in Maryland and Kentucky and the plains of Virginia? Black folks who were not trained to be enslaved people in the field, but trained to run horses so people could gamble. Once you know your history, it's easy. It's lovely. And of course, we could talk about the Italian influence, but I'm only 1% Italian, so I can't really do that. We can talk about the fact that Old Bay is the confluence of German, Jewish, and black culture in Baltimore. Because I know Ashkenazi Jewish cooking very well. I assure you that Old Bay is not usually included. Unless you're from here, and that's a whole other story. I do know that Old Bay chips are kosher because there's no actual crab in them. But the point is that you have to be able to imagine and understand people talking to each other, influencing each other, talking to one another and cooking together, eating each other's food, right? And then there's this thing where we have this barbecue-ish culture, right, with the pit beef, but with a Germanic horseradish tiger sauce, right? And we have the lake trout places, right? Cool, and we have like the greens and the this and the that. And we have cookbooks. You know, my favorite is Domestic Cookery by Elizabeth Ellicott Lee from Montgomery County. And it's like somebody smashed together Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with southern and eastern Maryland and a little bit of Virginia. You know, she was a Quaker. So of course she's going to pick up influence from all these different kinds of people she comes in contact with. And her family had enslaved people at one point, but freed them. And she talks about the black cook who had a name. And across this state were black cooks who had renown. Henry Dorsey was a caterer who was brought back into slavery, but his freedom was purchased by the people he knew in Philadelphia because he was such a great cook. And he bought his freedom with the food he cooked. Think about this, you know? So I just want us to really, this morning, really think about all the stuff that we were never taught, we never learned about, and why it's important. You know, a lot of times we get harassed as African Americans about progress and forward movement and intention, intellectuality. And I have to remind people, time and time again, we had those things, but they were taken from us. It doesn't make me a victim. It makes me somebody who straight up acknowledges that trauma is real and recurrent. And the bottom line is, you know, in Philly, we had black families from here and from Haiti who had catering dynasties that lasted 200 years, you know, passing down the family business. You know, you couldn't get married. You couldn't get, you couldn't, okay, let's say this the Maryland way. You couldn't get married or buried on Saturday during third period or on a Tuesday without a black caterer. And it was passe knowledge. You know, you knew who to go to. One of the best Southern cookbooks was written in Washington, D.C. by a family from Maryland and Virginia. I mean, again and again and again, these things just drop around me. I'm not done with, you know, the homeland yet. I really feel like I need to, you know, now that I have a little coin to me, I need to do some serious research and really make this it was a full project then, but now that I know a hell of a lot more and have access to more, I think it's a really important story to tell. You know, everybody's like, you know, we live 30 minutes from Partlow, Virginia. And when we were looking for a house, I told Taylor, I said, whoa, there's this, like one of the Washingtonian homes, right? And guess who that property belonged to? The Waller family, who owned Alex Haley's family. That's where Kunta Kinte was enslaved. And that big house was still there, but it was like, but you know, back in those parts of the country, they didn't keep things as they were. They just kind of like gutted the house and kept going. But the one outbuilding that's still there was the kitchen. And I'm just like, Lord, if I had $800,000, that, you know, it would have been a done deal. I would have put everything I had to, you know, consecrate that property. Not lived up, but like use it as a teaching place. Okay? We still grow a tomato, Plat du Haiti, that was brought from San Domingo when the Haitian Revolution happened. Okay? The fish pepper, another Baltimore African-American heirloom, that came through that process. So before we do some Q&A, I just want to let you know that the story isn't over. We have Arabers to document. We have taken for granted that we need to document every single menu of every single black establishment in this state. Because gentrification means the loss of black spaces. But also we have emerging Caribbean and African spaces. By the way, I went to the little Jollof Bowl. Baby. Having been to the other homelands, it's all right. And they had a long little line on it. And I also want to shout and recognize Baltimore's own David and Tanya Thomas, my friends and family, who've taught me a lot, and their attendees was the spot where they're still doing great things. And we actually traveled together to Senegal a couple of years ago, in 2020, before everything fell apart. But this place is so special to me because it contains not only memory and nostalgia, but progress and power. And my blessing on this community is that it keeps going because we have a lot to learn from each other. I may now be a Virginian, and actually my family goes back to Virginia to the beginning, but I'm very proud to be a Marylander. What did Douglas say? How did Douglas say? He says, I'm a proud Eastern Shore man built on Maryland corn and oysters. And that is special. I did bring this up here for a purpose. So I just finished. Fall of 2025, Phaidon published my Recipes for the American South. Thank you. And even though I didn't include Smith Island cake, which I'm kicking myself about, or fried okra, there was like 20 recipes I was just like, but you know something, when you get all deep into this kind of stuff, it's like a book is a marathon, not a dissertation. And it feels like elephant, what is the word? What is the word for the time that the mammal takes to birth? Gestation, thank you. So it felt like elephant gestation. You know, elephants take years. They take 2 years to birth a calf. That's why they're such a great family. They're just like, dang, you took so forever to get here. We got to protect you. And if you ever talk to a writer, and I apologize as a cis male for what I'm about to say, but it's like, there is a postpartum experience once you finish a big book. It's your child, you let it into the world. You have to there's a 6 months where you have to you go from a book tour or publicity, and then you have to kind of get over it. It's done. And you have to let it into the world, and people are going to say nasty things about your child, or they'll treat it a certain way, and that's just what it is. And you have to move on. After you spent 2 to 4 to 6 years or more working on a project, it's deep. But I'm very proud of this, and I'm very proud that I included Maryland in Southern food history and Southern culture and Southern cookbook, because most people don't, or they do it in a very tangential way. And I've, full-throatedly said you can't tell the story about Southern food without telling the story from this state. And I also wanted to show. I brought a few copies. This is a heavy-ass book. I'm proud of that, but at the same time, this ain't death of a salesman. I ain't running around with this book. So I did bring a few copies for sale, mostly through whatever Cash App or whatever you have. But I did lug it away from Virginia at 5 o'clock in the morning, so you better. And the Cooking Gene, of course. Thank you. This is this picture. I'm so glad that I put my tired, greasy self on this cover. Because, I think about one of my favorite people, of course, is James Baldwin. And I think about his voice, think about his image, and he's very self-conscious about how he looked and everything else. But something, I understand something. I will always be able to look at this person who struggled a lot to get here, who was sitting in the steps of his ancestors. And not pride is not the thing. It just know that I came here for a purpose, that I was always on the right path, even if it was difficult sometimes. And this book, of course, does start the story in the Chesapeake, does talk about both Maryland and Virginia, and really encourages people to understand that without Baltimore, without Annapolis, without Georgetown, which used to be part of Maryland, and other places, you can't tell the story without us, without our state, without our history here. And the many thousands of people who lived and died so that we can enjoy the foods that we do. I'm gonna kind of like stop. What time is it? Oh, dang, I'm doing real good. I thought I was gonna have you till 1 o'clock. Lord of mercy. I'm doing real good. So we can do a couple of questions and stuff, and then I think we have some space to do some books and stuff, other stuff outside. Yeah.
Let me grab the microphone.
Sure, no problem. Let's do some Oprah Winfrey stuff. Wait a minute. Let me take you back, Exennials. Sally Jesse Raphael. Aha, red glasses. You know what I'm talking about. Phil Donahue, yes.
Good morning, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, thank you.
If we were to take a culinary adventure to your top 3 places in Baltimore City to learn through our taste buds, you might be able to come up with it now. If not, if you could pass it along back to the museum so that you could email all of us, where should we eat?
That's a great question. Ugh. So, admittedly, I'm not a Baltimore native, and I'm a transient. Gosh. See, the thing about it is I've been through a lot of pop-ups here that have told this story. But founded places, unfortunately, even if you ask me about my hometown, Washington, D.C., I couldn't tell you. Not because I don't want to, it's because those places don't stick around enough.
I'll give you one.
Come on.
It's called Oh Honey by the Bay. It's a pop-up. It's fried fish. You go to their parking lot and park and wait. It's old, it doesn't matter, and you can eat their fried fish.
Ah. Oh Honey by the Bay.
But if you come up with some, Maryland State, and you could funnel them back to the museum.
You know, I give respect to my friends and mentors, the Thomases. They're one of the few groups of people who are really focusing on Maryland's unique heritage. We went to a lovely dinner they did for Valentine's Day. They had one thing I shouldn't tell David's business, but they had one of the most Merlin condiments ever, and he can't even eat it. Blue crab salt. Yeah, and it's real. And I just thought about it, like, we need people to bring to life. Okay, so when I was in Senegal and Benin, their crabs, which are not unlike our blue crabs, one of the best things I ever saw, I didn't taste them, right? But one of the best things I ever saw was smoked crab. And in West Africa, smoky flavors are really important to cooking. So they often use salt fish or smoked fish. Well, this was a smoked crab. They take it right out of the water, that bad boy, put it in the smokers like they do in everything else, and then they put that in a pot of soup. It's like, okay, we have a lot to learn. And Merlin had its own maple syrup industry. Our persimmons, our pawpaws, our native fruits, the prickly pears that used to be here, maybe still hanging on the beach, on the eastern shore by the ocean. We have all these things that we need to bring back to life, but also with that comes responsibility and stewardship. Okay? So because to have that, you need to stop chopping down the damn trees. You need to keep respecting our prairie, our diminishing prairie, our hardwood forest, maintain our little bit of bald cypress swamp that we have, keep our ocean clean, keep our water clean, don't overfish. The whole cycle, what fascinated me was the whole cycle of fish in the bay and its tributaries, which is based on freshwater, brackish water, saltwater. And not all fish are available at the same time. Or the fact that most of our fish through our history have been anadromous. When's the last time anadromous means a fish that goes back to the saltwater to breed and is born the fresh and the cold thing. So like shad, rockfish, or different species of herring, and alewife. When's the last time you went to a creek and saw it so silvery with fish you couldn't see the water? You feel me? So we have these amazing miracle moments from our historical past that we need to get back to. I, for one, before I leave this planet, would love to see a river, a creek like the Potomac or Patuxent or beyond, so covered in herring that you can't even see the water. All you see is silver. You know, we used to have oysters that were this big, and that was not uncommon. But what happened is they took the big boys and girls that make the other big boys and girls out of the water permanently, so all you get is this. We need to fix that.
Hello. I am so glad you brought up Frederick. I'm a historian, but I was born and raised in Frederick. And I just wanted to mention one thing, that all the Black families in Frederick would not make Thanksgiving was complete without sauerkraut with the gravy on top, which you're cooking with a ham hock.
So one thing that you brought up that's important to say is that we have a habit, all groups do this. You know, when you go to Peru, you have, you know, the fried rice that's Peruvian, right? It's Peruvian, Chinese, and also Peruvian. In the same way, we have blackified sauerkraut. We treated them like greens and did the sauce thing, which is very African Atlantic. And I caution people, because people get like, African, really? Because all I can think of is National Geographic and Tarzan. And they really do believe it has to be from the middle of the uncivilized, un-Western wilderness to be African. To hell with you. I've been there. That's not how it is. The first thing you hear when you get there as a black person is welcome home. Don't you tell me that we have a diaspora war, because I refuse to be part of it. Same thing with our Caribbean Afro-Latin cousins. So y'all saw Bad Bunny. I saw a Negro from New Orleans playing the same drums we played across the whole world, Afro-Atlantic world. That's our cousin, you know? So when I hear sauerkraut with the gravy and all that stuff, I'm just thinking we've blackified so many foods to the point where sometimes it's hard to see the line between us and them. And that's just called being American. Please, question.
My question was, as a historian, I will always argue when I teach my students about Maryland being a southern state. Do you include Delaware with that? Because I think you have to. I think it's right there. It has a similar history, a similar background, and it's just, when I think of that, I think of Delaware also. You never include Delaware in that, no more than you do when you think of these.
So I included parts of Delaware in this cookbook. But I also say that the northern tip is very much more like PA and Philadelphia. But people need to understand that Philadelphia is the most southern northern city. You know, enslaved Africans came directly to Philadelphia. Peter Kalm, who was a Finnish-Swedish writer and traveler, he talks about how no Philadelphian can live without hot sauce. And you know who he attributes the hot sauce to? He says hot pepper and everything. They love fried fish and oyster and everything with hot sauce. And then he talks about okra soup in the 1740s being a very common food. You know, Jefferson talks about okra being a common garden plant 1780s. So that's right in the period when the majority of West Africans are coming to the Mid-Atlantic and Chesapeake and beyond. So definitely the southern part, especially the southern county of Delaware, there's no question. It's an Underground Railroad history, enslavement history, a black waterman history, which is really important. So yeah, we have to keep in mind that you know, today Missouri may not be Missouri, may or may not be considered southern, but Celia, who had a very hard, before you have to say a prayer first before you read this book. It's called Celia, a Slave. I'm not really going to get into it right now, but her life was horrific, and she was enslaved in Missouri. There were several areas of Missouri that were like very heavy in slavery. These are all people from, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, blah, blah, blah. But she had a very hard, horrifying life. And I read this book once a year to remind me how grateful I am to our black women and how grateful I am to our ancestors. And that a lot of them were children. She was 13. And when you think about that, so when you honor those histories in Delaware and in Texas, now Texas Southern is a bigger issue. Because some Texans are like, yeah, other Texans are like, nope, we're our own thing. I'm like, oh my God. I despair of that conversation. But I thank you for that question and the comment about sauerkraut. I really appreciate you.
My question is both ichthyological and etymological.
Come on.
Tell us about lake trout.
There is no such thing as lake trout. You know that. It doesn't exist. It's whiting. Yeah. It's just like, but it sounds nice, doesn't it? Kind of like Chilean sea bass. No, it's Patagonian toothfish. But if you said Patagonian toothfish, people are going to go, I don't know. But Chilean sea bass sounds real good, don't it? So, I mean, it's that same play on words. But also, I think it's an issue of people just taking. We also have a great migration story. Are we a pass-through? What did John Waters say? Baltimore is what happened when people were going to New York from the South and their car broke down. I mean, it's just like, so lake trout is, I think, an example of something really special we haven't really studied yet, and that is that people coming north, we're a through place, are starting to reinvent the way they talk about food and culture. Because a lot of the first migrants were, there were people here in Baltimore, and then there are people who came up from Southern Maryland, from Virginia, and the Carolinas. And, we have a word in DC for that, Bama. And so that happened all over. The idea of people being country or rural. And it was just the same thing happened with Europeans. The German immigrants had the same thing. They detested the people who came after. They were like, oh my God, what these people are embarrassment. We're civilized, we're wealthy, and they were not. And so every community has this, and for good or for ill. The Urban League did that a lot. They discouraged black Southern migrants from expressing their culture. This is why so many things that made us who we are, made us special. I think of two examples in our popular culture. One is a soldier's story, or a soldier's play. Other one is Sinners. The whole thing about, I related to that because I had grandparents who kind of whispered these things to me. I often have a ditty bag. So when I saw that in the movie, I was like, that's my people, that's my culture. Because my grandmother in particular, my mom's side, and my grandfather, my father's side, they weren't ashamed of that. I love the way my granddaddy would talk. Where y'all going to? Y'all going to the store? He said, I got to go make water. I love that because that's what makes me a black American. And I'm just like, that kind of detail. So I think people didn't have a high respect for whiting. That was not considered a socially acceptable fish. But when people came here and they said lake trout, oh, sure, that's a lot better. We've graduated from whiting to lake trout. So thank you for that question because that's perfect. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
I'm glad you said the word graduated because I think that the DMV, I know I'm not particularly there right now, but the DMV area has a chokehold with certain items when it comes to the soul food experience.
Come on.
And so I am a private chef and caterer, and I've been doing this for 10 years. I am ready for us to get away from lamb chops
and Hennessy
and other staple foods, right? But that's all a matter of influence, and I know you have that. So
Yes.
if you were to pick some ideal dishes for the elevated, graduated DMV culinary soul experience.
Come
What
on.
would those items be?
Oh, y'all came prepared today. Dang. You know something? I'm not gonna lie. I think we can do more with half smokes than put them in Ben's chili. I think we need to return to hominy as a base, not just do, cheesy grits, because they're different foods, but it has a certain value to it. I think we need to expand what we do with crab, oyster, and even clams. We have our own clams in this region that are native, that are part of the fishery. Yeah, we have to, what was Tanya telling me about? Stuffed lamb instead of stuffed ham for those of us who don't eat pork. I mean, we have a lot to draw on. And DC, okay, so DC, there was a quote. I'm going to change the quote because it's offensive, really offensive. But one of the people who was visiting, I think maybe a senator or a congressman, said that everything in DC has a taste of the. He didn't like that. He was not from the South. He said, everything in DC has the taste of the. And I thought, do you know what that means? That we're present. And there were oyster houses and famous oyster houses and things in DC. One of the greatest caterers, he was born in the late 1700s and died in the mid-1800s. And his family is still around. And there was a thing in the paper that basically went, oh yeah, the Spanish ambassador, the ambassador from Spain is coming, and we woke him up out of his sleep. Can you imagine being dead asleep as a black man in them days, and some white folks wake up and say, get up. You look what happened to Solomon Northup. But he got him up out of a dead sleep to go start cooking for the ambassador. So we have a really old history of preparing really great things in the Washington, D.C. area. And I think we should mine those cookbooks, like the one I talked about that was the Southern whatever cookbook, and it's actually written by a woman living in D.C. And the cool thing about it is it has a menu for every single day of the year. And it's all seasonal. And it's like one of those Edwardian things where it was just like, you had to serve like 8,000 things per thing. And I'm like, how did anyone ever do this? And so we have to really mind those things. The Virginia housewife, she's buried over in Arlington. And Arlington wasn't a cemetery, it was a plantation. Arlington House. And the reason why it was a cemetery, she's the first white person to be buried there. And then after that comes the Civil War dead, which is the punishment to Lee. But we can draw on all these materials, but also think of it this way. Now that we know who we are and where we sit culturally in the world, why aren't we saying, okay, DC has an important Ethiopian and Ghanaian population. We have elements from Korea and Central America. I want a collard green arepa. For real. I want bebre roast chicken. Why are we acting like we don't have the globe in this country? I don't care what the other people say. I'm proud that we're a multicultural nation. I'm proud that we're gay, straight, atheist, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, traditional African, Buddhist, whatever. I'm proud of all that. That is our greatest strength. It's not being monocultural. And monocultural food is bland and tasteless, so. And being a Washingtonian, if we have a community in a city and a wider community and connections to Baltimore, to Richmond, Philadelphia, other places, and we have an international city, why aren't we doing more international things? I don't mean just in your little corner. One of the best meals I ever had was in Senegal. Well, not in Senegal, it was in Togo. And the chef at the hotel, we were like a handful of people that were there at that time. He was Thai. He studied in France, and he lived in West Africa for 10 years. And we met him, and he says, hey, what are you guys doing? He said, oh, we're on a culinary tour of Togo and Benin. And oh, wow. He said, you know what? If you don't mind, I'd like to cook for you. And he says, give me 2 hours. And we were like 13, 14 of us, something like that. And he said, I'm going to make you a great meal. And he combined Thai food and cooking with West African. And if they share lemongrass, ginger, galangal, turmeric, hot peppers, a lot of seafood and fish, grilling of meats. Can't tell you what he made. It didn't have a name to it. But the 8 things he put on that table were some of those spectacular things. And him and his cooks, who were mainly Eve from Togo and Fall from Benin, and some from Mali and Senegal, combined all those flavors to make something incredible. I don't know why we can't do the same. But also, we need to make sure and elevate and respect the fact that significant Black American cooking comes from these places. So, we need to get each other information and start cooking up some stuff. We need to talk, maybe have some sauerkraut with some gravy on it. Heard. No, I'm serious. We got to get this done. Cause we need to have something to celebrate when the moment comes. Thank you, God. God is good all the time. Yes.
I know there are a lot more questions out
like,
there.
let me cut it off there.
I apologize. But we are going to wrap on the lecture right now, so let's again give...
Hey.